We're going to move now to Veronica Manion of Geneva Health, who's going to speak to us a bit about the issues community support workers are facing before questions from us. Welcome, Veronica. We really appreciate having you with us.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Good morning and thanks for the opportunity to speak to the committee. I just want to give you some background. Geneva Health has worked as a key staffing partner with the Ministry of Health in its response to COVID-19. We have provided the clinical staff for the Wuhan evacuee quarantine site in Whangaparoa. Our staff have worked at the airport under the management of public health, assisting with arrivals and clinical assessment later on. We've provided the clinical and care staff for 15 hotels, looking after around 3,000 people a night in quarantine. We have assisted with contact and tracing. When Healthline had a surge in volume of calls pre-lockdown, Geneva partnered with them and stood up a 35-person call centre within 48 hours and supported them with the overflow of calls. I now want to talk about Geneva Healthcare's experience during the COVID-19 response. We are a subsidiary of the New Zealand Health Group. Collectively, the businesses within the group that deliver home and community-based services cover around 40,000 New Zealanders. These people fall under three funding streams: ACC, the Ministry of Health, and the 20 DHBs. The people we care for have similar clinical needs. We provide residential and home-based support to people with intellectual and/or physical disabilities, medically fragile children, some of them on tracheostomies and ventilators, all in their homes, people who have had serious and lifelong injuries, others that have had injuries that require short-term care. We look after a vast amount of elderly people in their homes and people with long-term chronic conditions. We employ 12,000 staff around New Zealand, registered health professionals, clinical psychologists, healthcare assistants, and community support workers. To offer you some context to our size and scale, we roster over 250,000 close contact visits a week. These visits involve personal care, such as hoisting, bowel incontinence care, catheter care, peg feeding, palliative care, support with medication. The handling of blood, vomit, phlegm, urine, and feces is a key component to the work that our people do. During lockdown, the home and community service delivery has been fraught with difficulty. We've been working with the current distribution process around New Zealand to ensure we've had enough PPE to meet the Ministry of Health guidelines. And also very importantly, we've had to manage the fear, the very true fear of our staff and the fear of the vulnerable people that we look after. The distribution centres at the DHBs were not prepared for our scale and our number of visits, nor did they seem to understand that we were requesting PPE for our other clients that were funded under ACC and the Ministry of Health. This, unfortunately, has resulted in a number of DHBs giving us less stock than required, or not sending any at all, as they simply did not have enough to go around for all of their other requests. I do believe everybody has tried. They've been wonderful, helpful. Our communication has been responded to, but we've seen little action and it's nearly too late. A number of vulnerable people that now need care are refusing it. We are fortunate we haven't had a legal strike from our workers. This is because they really care about the people that they look after. And many of the people that we do look after would need to be hospitalised if they did not receive the daily care that they need. The home and community sector is the sector that that prevents acute hospitalisations of these people. It is the sector that prevents early admission to rest home and institutional care. To close, the funding pre-COVID for our sector was inadequate. I sound like a bit of a broken record to everyone else, but it was inadequate due to new legislation mainly, which has since then seen an ever-reducing return. It's barely now break even. In some contracts, it is loss-making. Many providers are continuing to operate, but many are technically insolvent. This pandemic has exacerbated the situation. We will see many of these providers close. Redundancies will be occurring as the cost of wages is ever increasing. The current forecast for those requiring the level of care we provide in the community is set to explode. There will simply not be enough staff to care for the amount of elderly and high needs vulnerable individuals to keep them well and safe in their homes in the future. We have gratefully received some contingency funding for COVID, but it is inadequate. We are unclear on the actual breakdown of some of this funding to date and the calculation of how that's been worked out. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Veronica. And I sound like a broken ground record, but thank you so much for all of your thousands of workers around New Zealand who do, as you say, sometimes very physical work, but also very delicate work. And all of us with elderly parents and the like understand the great work they do. I'm going to go to Mr. Nardo.
Thank you. Veronica, can I first of all just acknowledge and thank you for informing us, not only here at Parliament, but also too for the rest of New Zealand that are listening in, about the role that you've played in your staff in regards to clinical care, both at Whangaporoa Airport, hotels, around quarantining, contract and tracing. It's been quite significant. Also too want to acknowledge that while we're acknowledging all of those in the healthcare system that are frontline and essential, in particular, as you've noted and highlighted, our community support workers who often take on the roles and tasks that many don't want to pursue, but they have done that. So please pass on our thanks to them and for the work that they do. You've highlighted a number of things and you've used quite provocative language, which I think is important. I want to sort of pursue that language. Last week, we had Garth Benny from CEO New Zealand Disability Support Network, and he talked about the risk for those delivering these frontline services in both the aged care and disability sector, and the challenge that they currently face and that you're talking about too. One of the areas that he highlighted, for instance, was just in regards to those in the sector were told not to apply for the wage subsidy scheme, as they were had the understanding that they would be recompensed at another time. Those are just one of the issues that are there. But you use the provocative words as little action. So can you just give us a sense there, maybe just expound that a little bit more about what you mean by little action?
Sure. I think if I talk about some of the key challenges that will probably help that make sense. So little action in regards to our escalated concerns to the key people at the ministry. For instance, communication. It's been inconsistent and sometimes conflicting. We have one home and community sector, but we have 3 different government bodies that are actually operating independently. I refer to the projects that I discussed at the beginning. They were all government led. It went really well. We had the military, we had the army, we had public health. Those projects went really well because of that connection. When we go to talk about PPE, where I say there's been little action, all of those parties have tried really hard to supply us with the numbers that we need. But we still to date only have 2, maybe 4 masks per worker to do 250,000 visits a week. Wow. The guidelines are changing. We don't have eye goggles. It's fraught.
Yeah, thank you. Des Gorman made in his opening remarks, which I think were 3 observations, which I think were quite telling. His third observation was about our lack of preparedness and a health system that is not set or fit for purpose to manage 3 different areas. And one area in particular was around a pandemic response. In your mind, what do you think in regards to the sector that we're talking about, the community support network sector? What could we do? What should we be doing better? What should the ministry, the government be doing better in order to prepare a workforce that was fit for purpose to be able to respond appropriately, instead of, as you've highlighted, though with good intentions, but the reality is quite different to what you're facing at the front line?
Yeah, I think with full respect, the government's done a great job, and I don't think anyone would have thought the whole world would have shut down its borders around about the same time. But I agree that we need to do better. We need to do better for the people we look after. And I think Des referred to a national approach. Having 3 big government bodies, one of them with 20 DHBs, all having a different line of communication, a different process for ordering PPE, different processes for funding, some not funding us at all. It's made it really hard for us to focus on the care of the people in the community. And so to answer your question, it would be get the CE of ACC around the table with the head CE of the DHBs, the head of disability at the ministry, Ashley Bloomfield, perhaps the Minister of Health, bring in some key experienced providers and go, right, what do we need to do? How do we want to distribute PPE to our people? They're all doing the same work. How do we want to fund our people in health to make sure that they stay working? What do we want to do with the elderly that can't go shopping? How do we want to decide what non-essential cares are? Because all of those different entities and organisations have a different view on that.
Thank you. Just what my last statement is that there's a statement that's been going around in regards just of late that, you know, while we're flattening the curve, we don't want to flatten the country. You know, you've made comments about the providers operating out of insolvency, and I think that's a real concern. While we may be looking at and feeling optimistic about that change, in your mind, how desperate and how critical is the condition of the providers at the moment in their situation?
It's bad. For the last 2 years, I've been on a joint working group with the ministry and some DHB leads, not including ACC. We have had some smaller providers open their books. If they close tomorrow, the entitlements that are owed to the workers, the annual leave subsidies, that's what makes them insolvent, the debt. Normally that would get passed on to the new provider to take on and run with the contracts, but the providers aren't wanting to take on that risk anymore because the margins and the returns are so low. So those workers, maybe 1,000 workers, could end up without a job, with none of their entitlements paid out, as you and I would have when we resign from our jobs, get our annual leave paid out. But most of all, the poor clients that provider was looking after would then have to be umbrellaed or helicoptered out to other providers, get to know new carers, new policy, very, very unsettling. And small regional, local Māori providers, for instance, there may not be the opportunity for them to provide those specialist cultural services. The choice of providers will reduce. And I think that's a shame for a country of 5 million people that we can't do better.
And so just to be clear, we are talking some of the most vulnerable in regards to the conditions of COVID-19,
yeah,
the very workforce that would care for them.
That's right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alfred. Michael Woodhouse.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Veronica. And I just want to say, I hope you get back to a normal so that you can invite Alfred and me to your Colour Cruise Race of Champions soon. It was one of my favourite days as a Member of Parliament, and a really uplifting experience with your clients and your fantastic staff. You talked about 250,000 client contacts a week, and then you said something like the ministry weren't prepared and the DHBs weren't prepared for the scale and number of visits. Shouldn't they have been? I mean, shouldn't they have known what they were buying, what they were contracting you to do? It just staggers me that they so radically understood what you were doing.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and it has highlighted that. When the distribution was set at the DHB, I think that DHB thought, well, we know how many clients Geneva has, or Healthcare New Zealand has, or Access has with us.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think that the communication got there that they were supplying for the whole region. So that included the ACC clients we look after, the individualised funding clients we look after, the Ministry of Health, home care based and residential clients. So again, it's just that lack of coordinated approach. And I think now, we're going into week 7 of since alert number 2, and now we've got some masks, 2 to 4 masks for our workforce. And I praise them. I really praise them for continuing.
I do too, and you certainly praised the ministry. I frame it slightly differently. I think they've done their best in difficult circumstances. But one of the things that's worried me is that their guidelines, which have changed twice since they were first published, still don't recommend the sorts of equipment that you are, and certainly your clients and staff, are convinced they need to stay safe and feel safe, to use Dr. Bloomfield's words. Can you just give me a sense of what the guidelines are saying and what your views are on that?
I agree. The guidelines are saying they must have access to full PPE if a client has been in contact or has COVID or is a suspected case. So they must have full PPE for that. If a status is unknown, the staff have to do a risk assessment and then have access to masks, gloves, gowns, and now goggles to take in and use with that client. The problem I have with the guidelines is right now, right here, a support worker going to care for someone in Whangarei that may assess that won't have that equipment. So
I'll cut to the chase, Veronica. I think that's really helpful in articulating what I was getting at, which is these guidelines are really confusing. Do you think that has driven not an ambivalence that would be unfair on our DHBs, but a reluctance to release the equipment that they believe was needed somewhere else?
I honestly, they've been great to work with. They've given us what they could when they could.
But that's been wholly inadequate in many parts of the country, yeah? Okay. Yes. So the last question I have is, you mentioned, and I want to quote you as accurately as I can, you said a number of vulnerable people who need our care are refusing it. I mean, that really worries me. And you heard me talk earlier in the meeting about the non-COVID health impacts, where we lock down so tight, we actually cause harm in other ways. Can you just give me a sense of whether or not you're seeing people refusing access who might be getting, urinary infections, falls, other stuff that could be worse than the COVID risk?
Yeah. Really good question, and that is my worry. That's what keeps me awake at night as a CE. We haven't seen the true outcomes yet. I believe somewhere in our sector this would have happened. People that have fallen that would normally be supported. To give you a quote from a lovely lady that emailed me, "Please cancel my cares for my 99-year-old mum. While in lockdown, I don't want too many people coming to her house without PPE. We will move her home with us. I will try and manage her care while I work and school our children. All the best. You know, that's not okay. My dad is 87. He's vulnerable and a falls risk category. Why haven't Dad's carers been issued with gloves and plastic aprons? How long does it take for the ministry to supply the much needed and promised masks and gloves?
Doesn't sound like families that feel safe.
No.
Thanks, Veronica. Thanks for what you do.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. We're going to go to David Seymour, then Ruth Dyson.
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much, Veronica, and all of the Geneva team for the work that they've done. Just coming back to a theme that you were on earlier, the fact that you've had to deal with Ministry of Health, a multitude of DHBs, and ACC as your three funders. And it sounds like it's created an awful lot of confusion. And yet you've actually been brought in to do some incredible things, setting up a camp, you know, and with 48 hours notice, for instance, for people being quarantined. It seems that you almost run a parallel healthcare system that has to deal with some of the inconveniences you get from the national healthcare system and then fill in the gaps. And so there's been enough criticism of the healthcare system and its response. I don't think we need more of that. I'm interested in how you do it, how Geneva manages to be so agile and get the right people to the right place doing the right thing. Because maybe going back to our conversation with Des Gorman at the beginning of today, there are things that we can learn from Geneva.
Thank you. God, that's a really good question, David. I think over the years, we have invested heavily in innovation and technology. When I say technology, I mean reducing the admin load for our internal staff. We've invested heavily in marketing, recruitment strategies. Our experience is health recruitment staffing. We've recruited staff internationally. We have no problem sourcing registered health professionals. We're agile. We spend most of our time thinking, how can we do this better, faster, quicker, for more value, but also for the better outcomes for the people of New Zealand. There's only 5 million people. So surely we can all do better at delivering, you know, high value, high quality services.
Well, that's really impressive. Could I just totally switch gear? In normal times, before all of this hit us, one of the biggest things that drives people to MPs' offices, I'm sure all my colleagues from different political persuasions will agree, is immigration issues. And I have a lot of immigration issues with people who are carers, who are nurses trying to get in. I just wonder what the picture looks like for Geneva and similar organizations over the coming months and years. Are we going to have an issue getting enough people with the borders closed, and you know, what might we do about it?
That's a really good question. Yes and no, David, because the current healthcare registered health professionals are kind of locked in, so we're not able to lose any to overseas. We may lose them to different parts of the health sector, but yes, over time, if the borders around the world aren't opening at pace that Australasia may, because we're nearly at stamp out, then absolutely we will struggle. We may end up having less qualified registered health professionals, less experienced registered health professional working in those key specialist areas. Certainly the community side would really struggle. Geneva's a certified and accredited employer under immigration, so we can employ registered health professionals and sponsor them. But you're right, we won't be able to do it if the borders are closed.
Yeah. So given that difficulty, some of the talk is about people reskilling and retraining. And I don't want to sound glib, but if you've got potentially 100,000 tourism workers out of a job, how practical is it for them to retrain to a point where you might be able to hire them, or similar organisations to Geneva might be able to hire them? I mean, is it potentially a 6-month retraining proposition, or is it a 3-year retraining proposition?
That's, gosh, some good questions. Absolutely, we can train them. We've got a really great online training company called MySkill, and also our registered health professionals do the on-site clinical sign-offs. The problem is that I think it could take 6 to 18 months for them to get up to a standard of care that a current support worker may be looking after a tetraplegic client, and that change. We could employ them in our call centres, we could employ them to become schedulers, but whether or not they'd actually want to do some of the types of tasks that I've described in my opening address, they went into a different industry for a reason. So I don't think that's a complete fix.
Okay, thank you so much for all the work you guys are doing, and really interesting answers.
Thanks, David.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. My question actually builds on the end of David Seymour's, but before I ask it, I just want to join other colleagues who have acknowledged the amazing work that you've done. And, you know, when you outlined it, you made it sound like that's just what we do, but it's huge contribution to the wellbeing in our communities. One point that you didn't make, and I think it's really important for our committee to reflect on it, for many of your clients, your support workers are the only social contact that they've had during lockdown. And you know, I'm very familiar with this area. I've worked in it a lot in various roles, but I know that a lot of caregivers and support workers are the only visitor anyway, but particularly during this time, that's hugely important. You've also given us some really valuable lessons to take from particularly the inability of the 3 funding arms that we have to get their ducks lined up. So I think that's a really important lesson, and we learn a lot of lessons during this stuff, but that's a really important one. What I want to ask about, and it goes to the point of potential staff shortages, have you got an idea of how many of your staff felt that they shouldn't be going to work because they were either vulnerable themselves, immune compromised, or whatever reason, their age, or they were in a bubble with someone who was in that position? What was the staff fallout as a result of that, and how did you fill those gaps?
Good question. So the New Zealand Health Group numbers that were over 70 or immunocompromised was around 1,200 workers. So on the 21st of March, we had to stand them down for their safety. So we managed to replace them, and over the period of lockdown, some home help or domestic services were ceased, or we were asked to cease them by some funders. So that kind of, there was a bit of a swap around there, but so we technically didn't have staffing problems. As I said in my address, we are lucky we didn't have a legal strike. The support workers could strike due to health and safety concerns, and the only reason they haven't is because those people need them and they have those relationships, and they would end up in hospital, some of them, if we didn't go in. So I praise our staff. Some of them are working extremely long hours, and they will be exhausted at the end of this when the other support workers can resume. So we've managed. It's taken really a lot of logistical operational excellence to achieve that in a fast-paced environment. And I know a lot of those workers want to be back at work. They miss their clients. They miss their colleagues in the community. So we're looking forward to maybe level 1, when we hope they can return.
Just further on that, you read out an email about a couple who took their father or mother into their own home, and I know that was very common just because people were anxious about not being able to visit them. Yeah. So that, you know, having them living in their home was a far preferable option. Have you got a feel for about how many of your clients were invited to go and live with their kids
I don't really know those figures, but I know how many asked for no services, and it's about 20%. That's across the ACC injuries, the elderly, and the disabled. So it's a lot. And my worry is that those people are receiving services because they need them. They've been assessed for those services. So we're doing our best to support them from telephony. We're doing welfare checks outside the house. They don't want us to go in, but it needs to be heard at the highest level. You cannot underestimate the stress and fear that these vulnerable people have been under, just because they are vulnerable. They are alone. A lot of them do not have natural supports to go to their homes. So it's, I guess some of the workers have said to me, we feel like we are the last priority. Someone wrote to me and said, I'm horrified to find my home care person arriving without a mask. Is this why old people are dying? So this is the sort of dialogue that we're getting. So as I talk about improvements, how can we remember that these people are in the community still because of our staff and our sector? If it wasn't for us, they would be in aged care facilities far too early or in hospital. So that's something to really remember. That is the importance of our sector and the work that our people do.
Well, thanks very much. Keep up your great work.
Thank you, Ruth.
Veronica, thanks so much. We really appreciate your time and your peering and giving us so much expertise and experience from an important part of the health sector.
Thanks, Simon.
We're going to now move back